Ultimately, you have to decide what's important for yourself. I can't tell you. No one can tell you. You can look at people who are doing stuff and be like, I want to do what they do. But even if you were to do it, like, you're not going to do it exactly like they do it. Mm-hmm. So you got to be able to generalize the concepts and say, okay, this is what I'm going to apply to my life. But then once you get that, that North Star, then you have some clarity. You can move forward. I always say you need a compass, not a blueprint.
Today's episode of The Pro Guide is brought to you by Small Pond Productions, the producers of this podcast. If you're looking to boost your brand's voice with professional end-to-end podcast production, whether it's an interview show or telling stories with audio, we walk you through every step of the process to make you sound great. Head to our website and download the free Podcasting Made Simple guide, 8 critical things you need to know before launching your brand's podcast. It's all available at smallpond.productions. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Pro Guide Podcast. Today, we have Mike Schmitz, who is the co-host of the Focus Podcast, along with David Sparks. Mike's also the founder of Obsidian University, as well as leading voice in the personal knowledge management and productivity space. Mike, super glad to have you here with us today. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Glad to be here. And don't worry, personal knowledge management is a mouthful.
It really is. The whole PKM. I didn't want to throw an acronym at people way too early, but...
I get it.
It is a lot to say. Personal knowledge management. Mike, I'd love for you to just kind of level set a little bit with us. Talk to us a bit about where you find yourself in the space of productivity, where people might have heard of you before if they listen to certain shows or look at certain things, and what you're up to kind of currently. I want to take the whole Connect With Me space and just kind of pop it here at the beginning, just to level set everybody.
Sure. Okay. Well, I don't know that I have a simple answer to that question because I'm still trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. But I do co-host the Focus Podcast, as you mentioned, with David Sparks. And kind of the tagline behind that is life is more than cranking widgets. So I've kind of always had this approach to productivity of doing more of what matters, but also I kind of rankle at the standard definition of productivity, which is kind of like get a bunch of things done, and having like the ever-growing task list and just like the focus on efficiency, always kind of like, where does that actually get us? Like GTD and stuff like that is great as long as you're in service of a bigger purpose or mission. So like if I don't get to, I guess, just like name the legacy I want to leave, but kind of the message I'm trying to communicate with all the different things that I do is you got to start with why. You got to know what your vision and your values are. And then from there, you can use that as a filter to decide what projects are actually worth pursuing. And then you implement the systems to help you do those things efficiently and effectively. But what I am concerned about, I guess, in the productivity world is just the emphasis on like get things done quicker, more efficiently. Because in my experience, your reward for getting your work done faster is that there's more work for you to do. And eventually you just get to the point where it's too much and something's got to give. So you're better off, defining what's really important and establishing those healthy boundaries before you get to your breaking point.
It's a really good transition because I feel like a lot of people all over are what I call rocket fuel, but no direction, just so much potential, so much efficiency, but just like, where am I actually pointing all of this stuff? And for you, the journey, I see a lot of, passion behind you about, there's a bit of a teacher's heart there. Like I want to share as much as I can with people that maybe aren't quite as on the bleeding edge of productivity as I happen to be. But I also see a passion for just how can I get as much out of myself as I possibly can in general for you. Where does that come from for you? Where does that desire to really see you make the most of yourself in this way show up?
Yeah, so it's impossible to answer that without getting a little bit religious. I apologize in advance, but my faith is very important to me. And kind of what got me into the productivity space was I had gone to business school and we were going to a church, and our church had a satellite Bible college. And I was like, I want to learn more about this. So I signed up, not because I want to be a pastor or anything like that. I always say I went back, got a Bible college degree just for funsies. Once I did that, I got asked to teach a personal management class. And as I was studying for that class, I was kind of realizing how all of the productivity principles that I was studying and reading and all these different books and different sites online, stuff like that, that was all lining up with scripture. And I was like, oh man, this is really a big deal. God's going to take this seriously in the Bible. It's the concept of stewardship.
But
So I was like, okay, I want to be a good steward of everything that I have been entrusted with. And really, like, I don't have any time to waste. People got to know this stuff. And I decided I was going to, even though I had never been a writer, I was going to write a book. So I started writing and publishing to a blog for about 2 weeks. I just spun one up and I'm like, I better just start getting in the habit of writing if I'm going to actually be able to do this. So I had been doing that for a couple of weeks. And then one of the companies that I'd followed online, they posted that they were hiring. And I reached out not as I want a job, but just, can I get more, can I guest post? I want more reps. And they're like, well, we don't really do that sort of thing, but we'll see, send, if you have any writing, send it our way. So sent them my blog. I'd started 2 weeks earlier and they're like, hey, this is really good. We see a lot of similarities, mindsets, things like that. We'll give this a shot. So that led to a part-time project, eventually a part-time salary, an offer to go full-time, which I initially declined, and then eventually said yes. And then from there, the rest, I guess, is history. That led to working with other people online and eventually me going out on my own. That book that I wanted to publish, I did eventually self-publish it. I hesitate to mention the name of it because if I were to go back and look at it now, I'm like, oh, this is so bad. Right? Anytime you make something, the first several versions of it are not great. Well, I haven't gone back and updated that book yet, but it was called Thou Shalt Hustle. And I hate that I used the word hustle. I still think like it doesn't mean what people think it means, but I've lost that battle to Gary Vee. And so like really the thing I wanted to communicate with that is like, this is something we need to take seriously. And we have to figure out, what are we here for? What are the talents and the abilities that I have, and how can I use them effectively to make the world a better place, essentially? I mean, you don't have to have a religious belief system to get behind that mission, but like I've translated it into what I call a life theme. It's kind of like a personal mission statement. And then I've got personal core values that align with that. But my life theme is I want to help people multiply their time and talent, leave a bigger dent in the universe, right? So like my shorter version of that is I'm a multiplier. And so I try to align all my projects, everything that I'm doing has to theoretically connect to that in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I had a day job not too long ago that I thought was going to connect with that. And I realized, this agency world, this just isn't really for me. But there has to be at least an opportunity for that connection to be there. Otherwise, it's an automatic no. And so that's kind of what I try to help people do, is distill that stuff down and figure out what's important, because ultimately you have to decide what's important for yourself. I can't tell you. No one can tell you. You can look at people who are doing stuff and be like, I want to do what they do. But even if you were to do it, like, you're not going to do it exactly like they do it. So you got to be able to generalize the concepts and say, okay, this is what I'm going to apply to my life. But then once you get that, that North Star, then you have some clarity, you can move forward. I always say you need a compass, not a blueprint. If you try to like get all of the steps figured out, you're going to realize that it's wrong. And then you're going to get frustrated. I think it was Dwight Eisenhower said, plans are worthless, but planning is everything, right? It's the intention that you set. So you have to understand, like, this is the next thing for me to do. And then I'm going to take that step. I'm going to look around, see what the results were, and figure out if I need to adjust course from there.
So cool, because I hear in your story a couple of things. I hear the alignment. First of all, you're starting from this place of I feel like these actions are flowing out of something that I consider to be at the identity level, and so therefore that gives you that clarity, that alignment with which to move forward with. The whole blueprint versus compass analogy, I think, is fantastic, because we sometimes just set all the methodologies around and look at them all and try and piece them together and say, okay, now what do I want to do? And I think maybe we get it backwards with the whole, cynics start with why thing. For people from the outside looking in, did you have this residual or repeating acknowledgement show up of like, hey, Mike, you seem to have some good thoughts, when it comes to productivity, that at some level you're writing and there's, people reading as well. They say, you're never an artist until somebody else calls you one. Is there a spot, is there either a moment in time or a general transition over time where you realize, what, uh, the external perception is matching how I see myself internally as well?
Sort of. So one of the things that was really impactful for me was reading Steal Like an Artist by Austin Kleon, because prior to that, I actually said at one point, I guess I'm just not creative, because I was seeing what other people were making and it looks so effortless. And I had this idea of creativity being this like flash of divine inspiration, and then Moses comes down the mountain with the tablets, like, here's my thing. And
Ta-da!
reading that book,
Yeah.
I realized that creativity is a process. It's more of a formula than anything else. And Austin Kleon talks about in that book about how when you are creating something new, you're essentially just connecting dots in ways that haven't been connected before. But the dots themselves are not original. It's the whole idea behind Steal Like an Artist. You are kind of remixing or repurposing things that other people have done. And then like that kind of caused the light bulb to go off of me. Okay, so if I want to create better stuff, then I really need to just collect better dots. And that's what got me into reading books consistently, and the genesis of the Bookworm podcast that I do, which is one where every 2 weeks we read a different business or self-help type book, and we're 193 episodes in or something like that.
Jeez, Mike, I think you're going to make it. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh,
it's a
that's
lot of
awesome.
books. It's an established habit at this point, But then once I started, just collecting better dots, I realized that when I needed to make something, whether it was something that I wanted to make, or once I started working with other websites, there were deadlines imposed. I didn't have to worry about, okay, I need to make this thing. Is there going to be anything in the tank? It was like you prime the pump by collecting the dots, and then whatever comes out as an expression of the act of collecting those dots is the obvious and logical output of the dots that I've collected. So I don't have to judge the output anymore. It's just the best that I'm able to do right now. And I mean, there's so many concepts that go into this, and I've been thinking through this whole process myself, and I've developed this thing I call it the creativity flywheel, because I was thinking through, like, when I was working with Asian Efficiency, I was in charge of the membership site and creating a different productivity course, a video course every single month. I think back on it and I'm like, how was I able to produce that? Plus do the productivity show podcast, which was weekly, and do all the other side stuff, and I realized that like I had this flywheel that was spinning. And then when I, got a little bit of distance, like, well, let's figure out, what were the actual pieces to this? Like, how was I able to always have something there? And it was essentially, I was capturing things whenever they resonated. I was curating those things and putting them into my, now we would call it a personal knowledge management system. I didn't know that term at the time. Then I was cultivating those ideas, and I was seeing where the connections were, but I wasn't forcing things before they were ready.
Sure.
And then I was eventually creating and expressing those ideas. And that's what people see. It's kind of like with hustle, that's the thing that people see. They don't understand the vision or the passion. The word passion literally comes from the Latin word pati. It means to suffer. So it's not like do what you love. It's what's really important. When you have a really important mission, there's nothing that can deter you from it. You want to show up and do that thing. So the motivation is there. But with creativity, you see the end product, but you don't see all the blood, sweat, and tears that went into it. And it's not a perfectionist thing where like, I'm really going to just really work hard on this thing. You need the loops. You need the iterations. The quantity produces the quality. I mentioned the book at the beginning, but it also, like with the podcast episodes, I go back and I listen to my first episodes and I'm like, man, this is garbage. And I remember spending like 12 hours editing that, trying to get out every and every and
I
it
thought
was
this
just
is
the
good.
fact
That's
of
right.
like doing 1,000 of them that's what brought the quality there.
It's interesting, that concept of getting the reps in. Sometimes it feels like you're covering the same ground over again. Like, oh man, I want to do something that means something. But I've heard the phrase, cycles, not circles. You're not going in circles. You're just going through cycles. And each time you cycle, you change as well. The terrain and the map changes, but also you change as well. And I hear you
Yeah.
say,
So
I love
you
the
got to do
phrase.
this.
Go
You
ahead.
got to do the cycles, right? But then also like just do the cycles and don't compare yourself to somebody else who's further along than you. That's the other piece is like teach what you know.
Yes.
There is somebody who wants to know what you know. You can help somebody who's going through the same thing, same journey. You're just a little bit further than they were. So don't feel bad about like there's this expert guru guy out there who people are probably following who says this stuff better than I do. Like, no, you have a platform and you're able to speak into somebody's life. And even if it's only a couple people at the beginning, it's still worth it. You still got to go through the cycles. You just got to get your stuff out there.
It's so important. It's so important. One of the best pieces of advice I'd ever gotten was back in 2009. Somebody looked at me and said, "Hey, you have a voice." And they didn't mean like audibly. They meant like you have a unique something that you need to share. And you shouldn't just retweet, you shouldn't just reshare everything. Like you have a layer of perspective to add to that. What I hear coming from you, and it's unique to you, and just as it is, I mean, anybody can take this and apply it to themselves. But for you, the layer stack of your personalities, it sounds like starts with data. Is this logical? Is this clear? And then stacks on the creativity on top of that lens. And so it's creativity through the lens of data. Other people may have that stack reversed, and that's amazing. Like I am creative at heart, just 100% creative. Let's see what associatively flows out of my life. But on top of that, I need to make sure that it connects with people in a logical way. And when you start to build these better dots, you talked about connecting the dots and making sure that you can collect better dots. Let's jump into the PKM space a little bit and talk to us a little bit about what this passion is with not necessarily just Obsidian, because that's the vehicle through which it all gets done, but really kind of, curating this content that you've generated yourself so that you have this kind of large paper trail of your thinking. How did I get here? And you look back and you can actually look through and some of that's the value of journaling, but just talk to me a little bit about what shows up for you, what drove you originally to create Obsidian University, but also what is it behind that desire to share with other people how to kind of curate their own second brain, their own mental space. Just talk a little bit more about that space for you. Why are you doing this for yourself?
Sure. Well, I mentioned the Still Like an Artist by Austin Kleon and then Connecting Dots, right? So when I first came across these connected notes apps, and Rome Research was the one that I embraced first. But I saw those big like graph views where you have like the constellations of all the different notes. And I was like, this is probably what's going on in my brain, but it's visualized in front of me. That's pretty cool. Now, I think those big graph views are completely useless. They look good on social media, but what the heck are you going to do with that? Where they're valuable, though, is when you have a single note and you have the connections and you can go to the next note in the chain, and then it opens up the next level of connections. And you can surf things that way, because then what you're able to do is see, oh, I didn't realize, I started here, but now I'm there, and I didn't really understand how these things were connected. Now I can see it a little bit better. And the sermon sketchnote stuff is kind of like that was my first project when I switched over to Obsidian. So I mentioned Rome Research. When I was in Rome, there's like no concept of this individual note. There's just these bullets you can drill down as far as you want. So, okay, that's cool. Then now I'm in Obsidian. Everything's local. Everything is plain text files. I like the fact that I can take these anywhere if Obsidian disappears tomorrow. I've got markdown files I can open somewhere else. But now I have to decide where am I going to place the boundaries around these individual notes. And I had my sermon sketch notes where I have like this sketch note I take of my pastor's sermons and then the individual verses that they mention. And I knew I wanted to be able to link like, okay, so this is the verse that he mentioned, click on that verse and then see the other notes that I'd taken that reference that. So build my own like cross-reference library. Well, now I'm in Obsidian, everything is its own note. Am I going to do this on the chapter level? Am I going to do this on the verse level? I'm going to do it on the verse level, that's like 30,000 individual notes. That seems crazy. But then I realized that the smaller you make these notes in Obsidian, the more powerful the local graph
Sure.
becomes. So I kind of I was thinking about James Clear in Atomic Habits, and like I was like, oh, atomic notes, like the smallest component pieces of information. Now we can use those in the local graph. So that's kind of what I did.
Sure.
Now, as it pertains to like you mentioned this stack concept, and I actually have something I talk about this in one of my YouTube videos. This concept called the PKM stack, because information is the fundamental building block of everything that we do. Right? We connect better dots. We collect that information that will eventually translate into the things that we do. So with this PKM stack, I've got these 4 different levels. I'm going to try to describe this visually, but I'll also share a screenshot with you. So this is, I want you to focus on the big boxes in that screenshot that I sent you. At the bottom level is the information. Okay. That's the stuff that we consume. And the information that we consume determines the quantity and the quality of the ideas that we have.
Sure.
So one way that you can work this PKM stack, if you've never thought about this before, is from the bottom up. So you consume information, you maybe, if you're not putting any sort of filter on the information, it's a bunch of social media and it makes you feel anxious, and there's really not a whole lot of tangible value you're getting from that, right? And then your ideas, that determines ultimately the actions that you engage with, the projects that you execute, things like that. Especially for knowledge workers, this is really important. Now, that from the bottom up, I call that the default life, because you're just at the whims of whatever information you happen to be consuming. But insert life theme at the top, I call it philosophy, right? So now you've got your vision and your values at the top. Now you can flip the script. You can be intentional about this, because your philosophy drives what you do. What you do determine, that's where that acts as a filter for the ideas that you are going to entertain, and ultimately even the information that you consume. So this again is like a flywheel, and then we've got a reflection process which we use periodically to make sure that we're staying on the right path. I call it a personal retreat, but every 90 days I get away and I go through this whole process, and I ask myself, what should I start doing? What should I stop doing? What should I keep doing? I mean, there's lots of stuff we could go deeper with in here. I'm going kind of quick here, but essentially this PKM stack, this doesn't have to be done in Obsidian. In fact, you'll see in the picture I shared with you, I have a whole bunch of apps that I use, and I figured out at these individual levels, what jobs are these apps actually doing? Going back to like a Clayton Christensen video about what job did you hire that milkshake to do? I'm happy to unpack that if you want, but it's a little bit of a tangent. Essentially, I'm very intentional about the apps that I'm using, and I'm not just picking the stuff that's new and shiny and, oh, it's got these features, but what is this actually bringing to my information workflows? Because information is constantly coming in, and I believe it should constantly be going out. Your mind is like a water wheel. So water has to come in, and eventually it has to leave. It has to flow like a river. When it doesn't flow, there's an input, but there's no output. Then it becomes a reservoir, and an unattended reservoir becomes a cesspool, kind of like, people called Evernote back in the day because you could put things in, not get it out, the Roach Motel, right? That's not Evernote's fault. It's the fact that people just keep dumping stuff in here. And I see people making the same mistakes with Obsidian and Roam and these other connected notes apps too. It's like, I'll just dump it all in there and I'll use the AI to surface the connections for me. No, you gotta put in the work. But when you do, like when you understand how all the things tie together, that's the hard part, is just figuring out for yourself what are the component pieces, and then you work those tools. When you work those tools and you know what they're supposed to do, you understand how this is just a part of the process. I mean, you get enough turns of this and it becomes effortless. That's the idea behind the flywheel. The flywheel, each turn it becomes easier, and each turn it actually produces more. So if you're diligent about doing the little things correctly and consistently, you never really have to worry about, am I going to be productive or am I going to be creative? That actually, like, that's further down on the further down the line, but that's what people see, right? But what you don't see is all of the thought and intention that went into crafting the systems before that. And then also, like, I guess you once you dial this stuff in, you sort of have to just be okay with, this is what I do.
So
Over the years, I've become more like firmly established in my workflows. That's not to say I don't love playing with new apps and new technologies and things like that. But the question is always, how does this make things better, or how does this make things easier? It's not, where can I tack this thing on?
And I love and I'll do my best to include that screenshot just so people can kind of get a visual of what you're talking about with the information stack there. I love the idea of being at the cause of the information you take in versus the effect, and the whole, information diet sort of thing, where you're really intentional about what shows up there rather than just kind of being whipped around by the whims of whatever you happen to come in contact with. David Allen, latest and loudest. I'd love to hear from your perspective over time, what is the hardest lesson that you've had to learn in productivity? Something that either was a difficult thing to come to terms with and say, you know what, this is really true for me, or something that, man, this just keeps showing up and I've had trouble. It's a pattern that either repeats, or just something that, I thought this would fix it, that didn't fix it, but eventually, whatever it is, you either made progress on it or got unstuck. Do you mind sharing what that would be for you?
Sure. Well, I guess if I'm going to try and condense this, it's essentially, you suck. Like, you're not nearly as good as you think you are. And that translates a lot of different ways. So number one, I think, is like, you establish these systems and you put these things in place. But again, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. So you establish the intention, and then you disconnect completely from the actual outcome. There are going to be things that happen, and there's going to be days where just like it all gets blown up, and you got to be okay with that. You got to be able to turn the page. It's one of the reasons that with the reflection and the journaling stuff, I no longer use these prompts that are focused on like, well, what did you accomplish today? What did you do today for exercise? Because I would get days where it's like, I don't have anything to
Nothing.
put here. And
I'm
this
worthless.
is the third day in a row. So I guess I'm just not going to answer. And then pretty soon I'm not journaling anymore. So I do this thing now called Daily Questions. I picked it up from Triggers by Marshall Goldsmith, where it's, did I do my best to? And I have my particular areas. So it's disconnected completely from the outcome, and it's based on the intention. Another way that manifests, though, is in when you are making your plans. Task managers are great, but you put in the metadata and then they give you the list. And so it's not their fault that based on your metadata and the artificial due dates that you added, that it's giving you a list of 15 things that you should be thinking about today. But the minute that you open your task manager and you see 15 things, how do you feel?
Yeah.
Oh man, today's going to suck. But I better try to muscle through this and get all 15 things done, right? So
Sure.
I view like that list, that's not the task list. I put very firm barriers around what I'm actually going to try to get done in a day. 3 most important tasks, no more than that.
Yeah.
So maybe there's meetings on my schedule, maybe there's not, but I'm going to pick no more than 3 things that I am actually going to try to get done. And it's trial and error to figure that stuff out. So like I shared a screenshot with you before we started. You'll see things on there like publish this podcast. There's a checklist that goes along with that has like 15 different things in it. But that they're all in service of that one essential task, which is getting the podcast out on the day that it's due. And so maybe that takes an hour or 2. So I've kind of figured out, that's a big enough task that I can make some significant progress on it. But I can also batch it like that. So I force myself to not pick more than 3 of those things. And 3 things, like that's a really small number.
Yeah.
Yeah. You hear the number 3 and you're like, there's no way I could do that. Especially if you work in some sort of corporate environment where like your boss is going to pop in and be like, hey, you need to do this today. That's where it's even more important to have those boundaries. But in the moment, you're like, oh yeah, I can squeeze one more thing in. But you extend that list and you don't get the things done, and you've now kind of proven to yourself that you're not as good as you thought you were. And then the next day you fail again. How long is it before you start dreading getting up in the morning because your task list is longer than you're able to complete? So you have to deal with your limitations. You have to establish these boundaries. Like those boundaries exist whether you realize they're there or not. And I personally think it's more important that you show yourself that you can honor the commitments that you made and you can follow through on the things that you said you're going to do. So I'm going to do these 3 things today, and then I'll do 3 things tomorrow. And if you really feel nervous about that, the thing I would tell people is don't plan daily anymore. Plan weekly, right? Think about what you want to do during this week, and then look at that every day when you're picking your 3 things, because we're really bad at estimating what we're capable of. We overestimate what we can do in the short term. We underestimate what we can do in the long term. So generally that's like 5 years. I think it even applies though with the personal retreat. I've seen it even in like the weekly plans.
Yeah.
So like a week isn't that long, but I still find like, oh man, this is the amount of things that I can get done in a week if I'm really intentional about it, and I'm consistently carving out 3 tasks at a time. That's always more than I thought that I was able to do. But in the moment, if we just live day to day and we just use the list that the computer is thrown in our face as a guide, it's quickly overwhelming. So I like to think of the computer like the list, whether it's a task manager or you're throwing your tasks in Obsidian or Notion, whatever, wherever your tasks come from, that is the brain, right? So that's great at showing you the things that you should be thinking about, but that's not the list. The list for me is a note card that I prop up on my desk and I work off of every single day. When I'm actually working, I don't want to go back and see that list. I use that when I make my plan for the day, and I also do time blocking as a part of this. But then when I'm actually doing the work, I find it valuable to have that as an analog artifact in front of my face, because the computer at that point is for creating.
That's right. Golly, so many nuggets in there, Mike. I feel like we could dive deep on any one of them and continue to rock and roll for another 2 hours. I love the default mode, where you're talking about actually having the analog, where you actually say, okay, I'm working off of this, and now my digital space is a place for creating and curating versus responding to something that I'm just kind of reacting to. I use the example of the updating the Christmas cards. In OmniFocus, I have a deferred date associated with like 4 addresses I need to update in our Christmas card list, and every week it's not the most important thing for me to do, so I'll defer it for a week or a month, and without fail, it's like August before I'm like, okay, I really should have either just said, you know what, I'm not going to get to it until it's really close to Christmas card time again next year, and be honest with myself and just defer it for 10 months. Or I think I have an inaccurate assessment about what I'm going to decide I'm capable of in the moment, and where I'm going to place relative priority on that. So it's so funny. Like, I've just given myself 14 points of decision, because each time it shows back up, I'm like, I don't want to do it today. So it's so funny to think about that, and living with that alignment and priority is a really cool thing. Or talk to me about what has been inspiring you recently or right now. Is there something that the new information, a book, a talk, that just information that you're consuming and that you've collected, that you're like, right now, this kind of has me lit on fire because I think about what it could mean for my life if I really grasp a hold of it?
It's hard to pick one, but I will try. The most influential idea I think that I have come across in the last couple of years, it's very important for productivity and PKM too, is this concept of the map is not the territory. I first came across this in a book called The Great Mental Models, Volume 1 by Shane Parrish and Rihanna Baubin. But the idea behind this is that a map, as good as it is, as detailed as it is, can never be a replacement for the actual territory, because to have all the information that's in the territory, it would have to be as big as the territory. So when you're thinking about making maps, some maps that we use, like if you get in the car and you're driving and you're using Apple Maps or Google Maps, whatever, to get somewhere, it's real clear what the important things are to be on that map. It's the roads that you're going to pass, the important landmarks, things like that, so they can help you get from point A to point B. But when it comes to personal knowledge management, there's all this information out there that's the territory. How do you determine what is actually important? You can't have somebody else say, hey, this is really important. Pay attention to this. There's just too much information, and there's a lot of good information, but you can never make the most, you'll never get the value from it if you try to just collect it all. At some point, you have to embrace the role of the cartographer, and you have to say, this is what's important. I've decided this is what's going on my map.
Yeah.
And essentially, like, that doesn't have to be an actual map, but essentially those are like the notes that you collect into your personal knowledge management system. What is important enough that it's going to be put into the collection? I mentioned real briefly the creativity flywheel previously. There's a step in there called curate, because the whole intention there is, I'm capturing all these things, but not all of these things are really that important. Once I get some distance from these ideas, maybe they're not that great, and I'm going to actually bias towards cutting them. But the stuff that's really good, I'm embracing the role of the curator of the museum. Those things are going into the collection in the museum of my mind. So that's really empowering and freeing, I think, when you have to decide, you get to decide, what of all this stuff that I've collected. Okay, I lied. I'm going to do a second one too. There's another one. There's a book called Liminal Thinking by Dave Gray, because it kind of goes along with this.
Okay.
In that book, he talks about how the amount of information that comes at us, it's like 11 million bits of information per second, but our conscious attention can only process 40 bits per second. So like your focused attention is like a record needle on a record. And so you have to be careful about what you're paying attention to, because his whole thing with liminal thinking is we have this small sliver of focused attention on our experience, which is one small sliver of what is actually reality. And on top of that record needle, we build all of our biases, we build all of our theories, we build all of our judgments. And on the top of that, we have this bubble of belief. So we surround ourselves with people who look, think, and talk just like us. So I use that to not like I'm actively seeking, this person that I completely disagree with, I'm going to go consume everything that they make. But when I'm interested in a topic, I'm reading a book because I'm curious about something, or it's solving a problem I think it might be a solution to a problem I'm experiencing. I'm going to weigh the information that doesn't really that seems contradictory. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to seek out those contrary opinions. And I'm going to consider those as data points when I'm making my mental maps, and I'm going to ask myself, is this true? I'm going to have strong convictions, but they're going to be lightly held, and I'm going to be willing to say that I'm wrong, instead of just like finding people to justify the beliefs that I currently have. I'm constantly trying to figure out where I might be wrong so that I can build better maps.
So good. I don't know if you've ever tried stream of consciousness journaling before, where you just kind of write down whatever happens to be on your mind. If it's a thought, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a task, but just the stream of everything that you just happen to place your attention on. And you give yourself a timer, say 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I'm just going to write down everything that happens to come to my mind. And it could be everything from like my left elbow's itchy to, man, I'm hungry for some chips and salsa, to, man, I don't know what I'm going to do about that report tomorrow. Everything, big, small, whatever shows up. And I kind of consider it a little bit different than a GTD mind sweep, because it's like, it's just not necessarily has your attention, but just is whatever happens to flow past you in the current of thought and life. And I've captured it and written it down. And it has astounded me. I don't do it often, but the times that I have done it in journaling, the amount of times that things that I'm either worried about or just completely have nothing to do with anything that's important whatsoever, how often I have the same thoughts. It's like, it wasn't even a big deal 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And it's not a big deal when I just looked at it right now, apparently, but it's something that is either worrying me or taking up my CPU cycles in my brain. And it's just so interesting what a disconnect there is between the stream of consciousness stuff that I've had show up in those times versus what I've said during the navel gazing sessions is important to me for my life's purpose, my life's mission. This is what I care about. This is what I want to focus on. And none of that shows up in there in the moment. You're like, I really want to have a huge impact in the world, but I'm sitting here thinking about, that my elbow's itchy. It's just a really interesting concept to me. I'm curious for you, if you have the one thing, I hate saying the one thing in a podcast because it really tries to soundbite it. So overall message, corollary thoughts, but anything that shows up for you in terms of, man, if I could wave a magic wand, snap my fingers, have something show up for the entire world in the space of productivity and have them get this concept and whatever that concept might be, I just feel like the world would be so much better off. And so whether it's your soapbox that you're standing on or the billboard, whatever metaphor we use for that, but just this idea that you put this out there and immediately everybody gets it. What is that thing for you?
I think if I had to pick one, it's probably the whole message of the life theme, because that alignment is really important and it goes beyond just an individual too. So like my wife and I co-host a podcast called The Intentional Family, and it's primarily her who does the work. I just know how to connect the technical pipes, and occasionally I'm a co-host. But one of the things that we did that was a genesis for that podcast was we as a couple got away when our kids were little and identified core values for our family. Then I had a graphic designer friend make a graphic, and I printed it, gave it to her for Mother's Day one year, and she said it's the best gift she's ever gotten. So they're literally printed and hanging on our living room wall. People see them, every time they walk through our house. And that alignment that comes from a family, you really feel that whether you have it or whether you don't have it, because when you don't have it, you're essentially like pulling in opposite directions. It's one of the things that excites me about working with businesses and organizations, any sort of teams, is like if you can get everybody pulling in the same direction, you can really affect a lot of change. But without that alignment, everything is harder than it has to be. So that doesn't mean that like because we have that, everything is perfect. We go through seasons where all of a sudden, we're like, why is this so hard? Well, we're obviously not in alignment. So let's get back in alignment so that things start to click again. But that concept of alignment, I feel like that is important across every area of your life. You may not realize it as evident as you would with a significant other. When you don't have alignment there, it's pretty obvious. But personally, if you don't have alignment, what happens is you end up saying yes to a whole bunch of stuff that you really shouldn't be doing because you don't have any sort of filter, and you feel, kind of to David Allen's point about the emergency scan modality, this might be important, I better say yes to it.
Sure.
Until eventually, you just can't handle it anymore. When you have that alignment, when you have a real clear purpose and vision and values, like this is who I am, this is what I stand for, this is the impact that I want to make, it makes all of those decisions easy. It does it in a family and a business level too. That when I was at the previous day job, I was the integrator. I was the operations guy essentially. And it was trying to get everybody to pull in the same direction. So we went back to the drawing board. Like, what is why do we exist? Who do we exist to help? How do we help them? What are the values that we want at our company that are going to create the type of culture that we want to have? Like, these are important questions that are important but not urgent. So generally people don't consider them because I got to go do the next thing. There's something I have to do right now. But until you get away, like, you're never going to get that clarity, and no one is going to just provide it for you. I think that's the other thing. Maybe this is a separate theme, maybe it's related, but I really believe in the power of self-determination, which kind of goes along with personal responsibility. Like, you have the power to change your life, you have the power to change your world. If you are waiting for somebody to give you permission to do it, it's never going to come. But you have to just take it. And if you are looking for the right moment or opportunity, like, okay, once I get a little bit of breathing room, then I'll consider this stuff. Like, it's never gonna happen. It's the whole chicken and the egg scenario. Like, you have to just decide at whatever point, you know, the way that I've been working isn't working, and I'm going to stop the cycle. You know, you're going this way, you got to stop and you got to go the other way. And when you first start going the other way, it feels very countercultural, feels like you're swimming against the current, but it does get easier. And once you establish some momentum in that direction, it really does make everything else not just easier, but I'll say a lot more fun. Like, the motivation and the motivation comes when you get the clarity, and the clarity comes from, you know, disconnecting from the busyness of the day to day.
One more question before I let you go, Mike, and it I actually didn't plan this one. It came with your last answer. I'm like, I got to dig deeper on that a little bit. I love the idea of the alignment being this force multiplier, either personally, you know, you hear the buzzword of integration, you know, integrated person that can travel further, faster. And at the organization team level, you know, when all of us are pulling the same direction, there's the force multiplication that the flywheel just goes easier. But I also feel, you know, there's people, I'm going to coin a term here, force division, you know, where there's somebody that is just pulling in all those different directions. They're at the whim of, you know, not really being discriminating about the information they take in, or what, you know, the busy trap of urgent, latest, loudest, and all of that. What is a good first step for someone who's grasping at integration, or grasping at that alignment that comes with, you know, the force multiplication that comes with that alignment? Is there a good question to ask, or a good just first movement that somebody can take that will hopefully take them in that right direction, if not, you know, take them there?
Okay, well, I'm going to give you a long answer here. So I think there are a couple important questions. In terms of the first step, you've got to break away from your day-to-day, and you got to spend some time thinking about the big picture. Now, there are lots of things that you can use to do that. I have one that I've created called a personal retreat, and I've got a whole course that goes along with that. I'm going to basically distill the whole course down for you in this answer.
All right.
All right. So first time I did this, I didn't know what I was doing, and I just started asking some questions. Over time, I've kind of refined it. So I've got my life theme, I've got my core values. There are different processes you can use for identifying those. But essentially, I'm reviewing those to make sure that those still resonate every 90 days. Then I go through what's called a Wheel of Life exercise, and I do this in Obsidian. So I have a big visual here of my current happiness on a scale from 1 to 10 in the areas of my life that are important to me. So I've got spiritual, career, work, love and relationships, health and fitness, personal growth, fun and recreation, social finance, things like that. Okay, so then I've got this like pie chart with the different slices of the pie as they go up from the center. The bigger ones are better off. Those ones that are smaller, those need some attention. Okay, so I ask what is contributed to these scores, and I jot down a bunch of bullets for each one of those areas. And then the lowest areas, those are the ones that if they're all low, you want to pick like 1 or 2 that you're actually going to take action on. This kind of gets into like the 12-week year concept. So we're not going to try and touch every single area. We're going to try to move the needle in one of these areas, and then during our next 12-week year, 90-day personal retreat, whatever, we'll adjust, and we'll tackle a different one. But in terms of like, how do I actually move the needle in those areas? There's some other questions that I ask here. One is, what did I accomplish? Because I tend to lose sight of that stuff. So it's important to recognize what I actually did well. Kind of related to that, what went well, kind of what's working in terms of my systems, what could have gone better. At this point, I usually take a break, and I come back and I ask 3 questions, which are extremely simple, but they are magical. So what should I start doing? What should I stop doing? And what should I keep doing?
See.
And I force myself to spend at least 2 hours answering these 3 questions, because after 20 minutes, you'll have a couple things for each one of those lists. But that's surface level, and your brain is just kind of conditioned, okay, on to the next thing. If you force it to wrestle with this stuff, you'll hit another level and you'll get the really good stuff. Okay, so I create bullet lists of these things. I always force myself to pick at least one thing to stop doing. That creates margin for other opportunities that I get excited about, because I do tend to get excited about new opportunities. And then based off of there, what are a couple of intentions that I want to be focused on over the next 90 days. So for me lately, it's been growing my YouTube channel and then growing my email newsletter list, as I'm a full-time independent creator only for about 10 months. I know I got to get the email list high enough, and then everything gets a lot easier.
Right.
So everything that I do is kind of in line with that. So that's my process. That's a short version of what is actually in the course. You don't have to follow that exactly, but you do need to get away and think. Keith Cunningham wrote a book called The Road Less Stupid, and he has a quote in there that essentially is like, I don't need to do more smart things. I need to do less dumb things. I need to stop swinging at bad pitches. And that applies to your personal life as well. You got to quit doing stuff that doesn't hit the mark. And just because you said yes to something 4 or 5 years ago because of some social pressure, that doesn't mean that you should still be doing that thing today. And yes, is it uncomfortable to go back to that person and say, I don't really think that I should be doing this anymore? Yeah, that's a difficult conversation. But when you know that it's not in service of what is really important to you, and you have other things that you are more excited about because you've got the clarity and there's the momentum there to follow through on those things, now you can see, oh, this is better, and I'm going to choose this instead of that other thing.
It's a mouthful, but that is so good, Mike. My gosh. Oh, man.
Sorry, I know that's a lot.
No apologies whatsoever. It's a lot. It's food for thought. Honestly, this is, for me, this is taking in a lot of information, and now I really do need to go into the cave and sit there and think about this. Like, okay, what does that all mean at an individual level? But before we let you go, how can folks stay in contact with you, connect with you, find out what you're up to, what you're doing? If they want to stay in your orbit and they say, man, I've heard Mike Schmitz and I want to hear a little bit more from him, how can they do that?
Yeah, well, the best place to go is MikeSchmitz.com. I have the domain now, so that's great. And I have links to everything else that I do there. The big thing, if you're going to sign up for one thing, I would say sign up for the email newsletter, because every Monday I share an original essay on applying values-based productivity principles to make more of your notes and ideas. So it's around this whole idea of personal knowledge management. I link to something cool, which is usually Obsidian related, but occasionally it's not. And then I share, I take these mind map book notes for all these books that I read, and I share one of those mind maps from a book that I've read in the newsletter. So that's a great place to start. And if you have any questions about any of their projects, all the links and things can be found on that website as well.
Mike, what a wealth of an episode. There's a lot here. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. I know that your time is valuable and you spend it with intention. So I don't take it lightly that you spend it with us. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. It's a lot of fun.
And our thanks to all of you for listening. If you're looking for a quick way to make our day, a review in iTunes or subscribing to this podcast would mean the world to us. Our thanks to Small Pond Productions for sponsoring. And this was The Pro Guide. Learn from leaders, change your life. See you, everybody.